Scarface is a classic gangster movie directed by DePalma, a loose remake of the 1932 rise and fall crime film of the same name, but updated to reflect the 1980s drug trade in Miami. We follow Tony Montana, played by Al Pacino, a Cuban immigrant who arrives in Miami and quickly rises in the criminal underworld through his drive, ambition, and fearless attitude. He becomes involved in the cocaine trade, working for drug kingpin Frank Lopez, and eventually takes over Lopez's empire. As Tony's power grows, so does his paranoia and recklessness. His relationships with those close to him, his best friend Manny, his sister Gina, and his wife Elriva, begin to deteriorate. Tony's fall is marked by betrayal, violence, and excess, culminating in a dramatic and bloody showdown at his mansion. Before we continue, say hello to my little subscribe button down below. Be sure to click on it for more videos on gangster movies and crime films. Tony, frustrated at his time as a dishwasher, watching people partying at a nightclub from across the food stand he works in, is offered a job by Frank's number 2, Omar, to unload drugs from a boat from Mexico. Manny is more than happy to do the work, but Tony aggressively questions the pay. Omar tells him that he has to work his way up, but Tony pushes it, leading to an argument. It's then that Omar's driver tells him to offer Tony a Colombian job, which ends up being almost a suicide mission. However, Tony comes away unscathed and successful from the job, eventually meeting Frank and rising fast. Frank sends Tony and Omar to a Bolivian drug supplier, Alejandro Souza. He would go himself, but he has an upcoming trial in the States. During the meeting, Tony and Omar bicker and argue in front of Souza, with Tony trying to agree terms which Frank did not agree to, and Omar not willing to go ahead with the deal which his boss has not authorized. Midway through, Souza is interrupted by Hector Salamanca for a phone call, and when he comes back he agrees with Omar that he should go back to the States to discuss with Frank, but curiously asks Tony to stay. Tony does, and a few minutes later he is given a shocking sight. A severely beaten Omar thrown off a helicopter, with Souza telling Tony that Omar was a rat, that an underling had recognized him as a police informant, and that's what his call was about. The two resume their business meeting, but the issue of whether Omar really was an informant or not is never really confirmed. Tony doesn't seem to care either way, he never liked the guy, and now it's an obstacle out of the way. So, was Omar actually a chivato, or did Souza have other reasons for wanting Omar out of the way? Frank later questions Tony about this, saying, "You bought that line?" implying that we should at least consider whether Omar really was an informant. From a narrative perspective, it's a memorable exit for a character who, by this point in the story, would essentially become redundant, and his death would speedrun the wedge between Tony and Frank. I remember thinking the first time I watched Scarface as a kid, that I found this to be the most disturbing scene in the film. The way the scene comes out of nowhere, and how Omar looks like he's genuinely struggling for his life and utterly perplexed with fear. Now, there's a lot of things that happen regarding Omar that can actually point to evidence that he was an informant, and that he wasn't. Like, for example, when Omar walks away, he has a nervous, ominous look on his face. On one hand, this could be argued that the rat is starting to feel the walls closing in, that he's been found out. On the other hand, it's perfectly fine to feel unease when you're in a drug kingpin's compound and you're being led away while your partner stays behind. Ultimately, I don't think a concrete answer is ever given. Either the filmmakers left it open for the audience to decide, or they just didn't think much about it. Personally, I think it does probably make more sense for Omar to have been a chivato. So, what motivation would Souza have to take Omar out if he wasn't a rat? Well, clearly Omar wasn't hot for Souza's terms, wanting to go back to the States to discuss with Frank. As we see later, Frank was furious at the deal that Tony made. If Omar made it back to the US, the deal doesn't get done. But Souza can see that Tony is more likely to strike a deal on his terms, so it makes sense to get rid of Omar and deal with Tony only. Acute gangster movie fans will notice a similarity with the scene from The Godfather, where Virgil Sollozzo can clearly see Sonny was hot for his deal, a deal Don Corleone turned down, so he decides to take out the Don and deal directly with Sonny. After all, a deal is proposed, Omar turns it down, Omar is killed, Tony accepts the deal. It's easy to see why Souza would want Omar out of the way. Also, Tony, in the words of Omar, was a peasant. He was unruly and wild. He even eats the lemon out of the finger washing bowl, which Souza notices. Perhaps Souza thought it would be easier to deal with such an uncultured swine who won't last, and who's not versed in drug politics and business dealings, and it was an easier deal for him. After all, he managed to get Tony to agree to a deal that actually made Frank afraid that he wouldn't be able to come up with the cash. Maybe Souza would have even killed the both of them had Tony not expressed interest in the deal. It's also an opportunity to get rid of a Frank loyalist and lock Frank into a deal by having Tony agree to it. It's also a chance to scare Tony, to test his mettle. This is indeed one of the few times in the movie where Montana genuinely looks uneasy, when he recovers and doesn't flinch when Souza threatens him. It also undermines Frank, the idea that he had a rat in his crew and didn't know. It's a way of Souza inadvertently telling Tony that his boss is a chump, and Tony didn't need any encouragement in that department, as he already had his eyes on being boss. And no doubt, Souza would much rather deal with a peasant like Tony than Frank. Heck, with a guy like Tony in charge, Souza could essentially swallow up the entire organization, which it could be argued he would end up doing after the movie ended. And even if he didn't end up going that far, it's clear that Souza admires Tony's bluntness, honesty, and his courage. As Frank says about him, you get a guy like that on your side, he breaks his back for you. Souza was intelligent and shrewd, perhaps the smartest criminal in the film, and he would see that Tony is a man who could be used and manipulated. But it's heavily implied that Souza was not lying when he said it was the call that told him Omar was the rat. Hector Salamanca signals Souza, who is in an important meeting, and as soon as Souza gets there, Hector talks to him, motioning the duo at the table. Souza looks taken aback at first, but then picks up the phone, continuing the ruse. The two men continuing their conversation while looking at Tony and Omar. They're out of earshot, and the duo at the table aren't looking at them, so it's far-fetched to suggest this is all some kind of setup, and it's one of the strongest evidences that Souza did indeed find out there and then that Omar had been identified as a rat, and he didn't kill him because of anything mentioned at the table. If Omar was innocent, then what was this conversation between Souza and Hector about? Why would Souza be interrupted and the two continuously look at the table? What, were they saying, hey, isn't that Beethoven's rival, Salieri? It doesn't also seem like this conversation was Souza getting up off the table to sanction a hit on Omar based on Omar's refusal of the deal, because it's the henchman who instigates the conversation and who does most of the talking. Why the need for all this theatre if it isn't genuine? The method of execution is also very excessive and elaborate if he wasn't an informant. Why not make him disappear? Make it look like an accident if you want him gone. Souza would know the public brutal display would anger Frank, and surely he would only do that if he was absolutely sure Omar was an informant. A major indication that Omar was talking to the cops was that Souza actually names crews that Omar took down. As he says, he put Vito Duval and the Ramos brothers, Nello and Gino, away for life. By mentioning names, this is information that Tony or Frank could actually look into and verify. This adds a lot of credibility to Souza's story because it would be extremely elaborate to fake a phone call and then throw out fake names unnecessarily. Some might argue that he knows a guy like Tony doesn't really care and wouldn't investigate the names, but he'd have to know that Frank would make inquiries. Are there any other details in the film that provide further clues? Well, it's curious to note that when Omar and Tony talk earlier in the movie and Omar is angered by Tony's disrespect, he appears to begin to pull a gun, but his partner stops him, instead suggesting the Colombian deal. Would an informant really pull a gun on someone? Then again, one could argue that as informants are not supposed to be involved in murders, perhaps sending him to the Colombians is exactly what a rat would do, as of course it's heavily implied that Omar knew the job was a death trap. Tony even later says that they were set up, and Frank shoots a nervous-looking Omar a look, saying if people did business properly, things like this wouldn't happen. But even if Omar did set Tony up, that doesn't prove anything either way. 1980s Miami was like the Wild West, and there's been plenty of examples of informants involving themselves in crime and murder. He could have simply set him up on a deal which was high risk, almost 100% chance of failure, because he doesn't like his attitude. And if somehow Montana survives with the cash, then it's win-win. If he dies, he dies. Even the look Frank shoots Omar, that could simply be his anger that Omar sent in cowboys like Montana, risking his money, and it's only because of Montana's ferociousness that the deal was a success, not because of Omar's planning. Omar's way of acting, his body language, comes across as a man deeply uncomfortable, scared that he's going to be muscled out of the important conversations. The way he rushes past Tony up the stairs when Tony first meets Frank, him awkwardly laughing at everything Frank says in the club, his erratic behavior in the Sousa meeting, where he is not in the US, far from home, far from any help from the feds. Of course, this can be explained away as Omar simply being an insecure man who feels his position is being threatened by Tony's rise. Again, it works both ways. It's interesting that Frank does have Mel Bernstein as a partner, who was a corrupt cop. Frank had connections in the police department, and who's to say he wouldn't get Omar to make a phone call every now and again to the cops to have rivals arrested, and Omar just got caught. This would expand the theory and actually suggest that Frank himself was in bed with the cops, Whitey Bulger style. Perhaps Frank and Sousa were in a kind of political chess game war, with Vito Duval and the Ramos brothers being Sousa partners who Frank had sent to prison, and he responded in turn by taking out Omar. At the very least, Frank distrusts Sousa, and upon Tony's return, he would have seen that the cards were being stacked against him. All of a sudden, he's lost his number 2, and he has an ambitious understudy who has won Sousa's favour. Either that, or similar to how Mel approached Tony, asking him if any new players were setting up shop, who's to say Omar wasn't approached at one point with a similar line of inquiry? So what do you make of this? Do you think Omar was an informant or not, and why? Let me know in the comment section below. Subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.